Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this third webinar of a three-part series, the BJA Technical Assistance Webinar, Budget Advocacy in the 21st Century. This series is brought to you by the American University Office of Justice Programs and the National Legal Aid and Defender Association, and is funded by the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance. Again, thank you for joining us. We have with us two presenters who will be providing more information throughout the next hour. And the information that they will be providing will touch on the ABA 10 Principles of a Public Defense Delivery System. Back in the summer of 2014, the American University Office of Justice Programs, in conjunction with NLADA, delivered a survey to many of you who responded on some of the information that you would like to learn more about, some of the areas that you'd like to learn more about. And certainly budget advocacy was one of those things. And the series does speak to and help public defender offices meet some of the 10 principles listed, such as independence, which is the first of the 10 principles. We also did data analysis and collection and analysis webinar in April 30th that spoke to caseloads and workloads. And also number 10 on the 10 principles to help the Defense Counsel to review their offices for quality and efficiency according to national and locally adopted standards. So the first webinar that we delivered was in January on cultivating relationships, and that webinar is available on the American University Office of Justice Program website, on the Right to Counsel Technical Assistance website, and we'll provide more information on that a little bit. And the second webinar that I just talked about, data collection and analysis for budgeting advocacy, is also found on that website. We are live and talking about session 3, Persuasive Budget Advocacy, and we have with us the two presenters. First, I'd like to introduce Adam Plotkin, who is the Legislative Liaison for the Wisconsin State Public Defender. He will be able to talk to you about the budget advocacy in practice and his recent experiences with budgeting advocacy before the Wisconsin State Legislature. We also have with us Monisha Sum, who is Vice President of Spitfire Strategies. She is a communications expert who will be able to provide us with some information and tools and tips on how to better advocate for budgets or for bills that are in the favor of increased public defense or other issues that you would like to improve your messaging. And we will be able to ask these experts questions that you may have regarding budgeting advocacy. And some of those questions that we will be looking at are, now that you've cultivated relationships and analyzed data, now how do you use this information to advocate persuasively? Again, what are some tools and tips for persuasive advocacy? And we can talk about how persuasive budget advocacy has benefited not just Wisconsin's office, but potentially other offices. And so you'll have the opportunity to both type in questions for the panelists and also type in comments as well. And we would like to hear from you if you've had some successes and if you've employed other tools as well to increase your budget and legislative or city council or other political advocacy to improve the delivery of public defense in your jurisdiction. So without further ado, I would like to hand our presentation over to our first presenter, Adam Plotkin.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to thank Michelle and NLADA, as well as the Bureau of Justice Assistance and American University for having me for part 3 of this 3-part series. I want to start out with a little bit of an overview of the topic and our agency. In 1977, the statewide public defender was created as a hybrid system in accordance with the, at that time, yet to be developed ABA Principle of Indigent Defense Number 2. We are governed by a 9-member board appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. A majority of the board members must be attorneys, and historically of the 9 members, we usually have about 5 or 6 who are. The remaining members usually bring a good broader perspective based on their work with our clientele, usually in other settings. And of the 5 to 6 attorney members, usually most of them either have in the past or are actively taking private bar appointments from the agency. The board has very specific statutorily authorized powers. They can hire and fire the state public defender. They officially approve and submit the biennial budget requests. They promulgate administrative rules. They serve as the administrative review board regarding decisions related to the private bar. There are also 2 things they're specifically not allowed to do. First, they can't make decisions related to the handling of any cases, and they're not allowed to interfere with the public defender or the staff in carrying out professional duties. So we largely see this governance structure as being in substantial compliance with principle number 1, independence, with one important caveat, and that is, as an agency that's more than 98% funded by state tax revenue, there will always be some measure of dependence on legislators to authorize funding. Until the late 1990s, the agency didn't have a single person solely dedicated to legislative relations. The public defender herself is, of course, a primary contact, but has significant demands on her time in other areas. We've had other people do the job kind of part-time or in addition to their normal work. Our legal counsel, the training director, the deputy public defender, but all of them also have significant demands on their time. So really what we hoped for was to identify a natural champion within the legislature and kind of hope that they could carry the water. This led to some unstable funding and policy decisions from about the early 1980s until 2001, where it culminated in a pretty public disagreement with the governor at the time relating to our budget. Ultimately, things turned out okay, but it was a pretty painful and public process. Just before that fight, we were able to repurpose 2 positions within our administrative offices. One to serve full-time as a communications director and another to serve full-time as legislative liaison. This allowed for a more comprehensive and dedicated attention to supporting the agency and its mission with the public and policymakers. My position serves as the primary point of contact for legislators on pending legislation, including the budget bill and other issues. But in reality, given limited staffing to accomplish administrative tasks, I also wind up working with courts personnel and other government agencies on a state and local level on a wide variety of policy-related matters. It is helpful for me, actually, to be involved in that broad range of issues, since, as a mentor once told me, everything relates. A small issue in how we process fiscal bills, a practice issue in a small county, even personnel matters wind up becoming the purview of legislators. I want to talk a little bit about successes we've had since 2009 Act 164. Maybe before I get to Act 164, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. Prior to serving as the agency's first person hired specifically to do legislative liaison work, I worked for a legislator who served in both our state assembly and Senate. That legislator's district per capita sent the highest number of individuals to state correctional facilities of any legislative district in Wisconsin. At one point, the Department of Corrections told our office that we had more contacts about conditions of confinement issues than the other 131 legislators combined. I had a pretty good understanding of the effect of the criminal justice system and was certainly aware of the role of the public defender's office, but I really got a chance to know the agency and its staff in working on legislation that became 2009 Wisconsin Act 164. For many years prior to 2009, the SPD had been attempting to increase the income and assets threshold to qualify for state public defender representation. As late as 2010, eligibility was based on the defunct 1987 Aid to Families with Dependent Children guidelines. So basically, if a person made more than $8,000 a year, they didn't qualify for a public defender. So many people just over the threshold wound up being appointed an attorney at county expense, which was more costly to taxpayers since most counties reimburse attorneys at $60 to $70 an hour rather than the SPD rate of $40 an hour. There also was less consistency both in when an appointment was made and the standards of practice, and overall it was just less efficient. So an update to the eligibility guidelines was included in the 2009 biennial budget, but ultimately vetoed by the governor. So the agency approached my boss at the time to see if he would sponsor standalone legislation to set the rate at 115% of the 2011 federal poverty level guideline and to index it in the future to increases in those guidelines. So we worked with the agency to get and build consensus within the legislature, which was controlled by Democrats in both houses at the time. We had a broad base of support at the public hearing. The Republican Attorney General, the Liberal Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the Wisconsin Counties Association, among others, all testified in favor of the standalone legislation. The bill wound up passing and being signed by a Democratic governor with a delayed effective date. Between the time Act 164 was signed and that delayed effective date, an election brought in a Republican governor and switched control of the state assembly to Republicans. Because of the major increase in the eligibility guidelines and the significant increase in the number of expected new cases, it wound up being right on target. We predicted about 12,000 new cases. I think it came in about 12,200 in that first year. The delayed effective date was to allow the 2011 budget to increase SPD staffing and to provide funding to accommodate the changes from Act 164. Fortunately, the new governor recognized the need to fund the agency in light of Act 164 and provided for it in the 2011 budget, though the legislature did at the last minute remove the indexing provision, so we are at this point permanently locked to 115% of the 2011 federal poverty guidelines. Since Act 164, there have been several other successful initiatives. One is creation and funding of a statutory pay progression system to retain experienced trained attorneys on a merit-based system. And the funding in 2013 budget, additional funding was included in the 2015 budget. I just want to make a special note on the pay progression item. In developing the system and determining the appropriate level of funding, we worked collaboratively with both the Assistant District Attorneys Association and the Department of Justice to set funding at a level roughly equivalent between us and the DAs, which is a good, though limited, example of parity in resources consistent with ADA Principle 8. In addition to Act 164, the governor provided an additional 26 staff attorney positions in the 2015 budget that was signed just a few weeks ago. Also in the 2015 budget, we received an increase in the base funding to pay private bar attorneys based on a formulaic reestimate. We've also had some successful impact on standalone legislation. We limited the scope of proposals during the 2013 legislative session, which would have waived the right to counsel for a client's failure to appear at a termination of parental rights proceeding. Another which would have increased the ability for jailers to strip search people after arrest. We've made positive changes to and limited the harm of some provisions contained in an over 300-page bill rewriting the state's criminal code. And we're also increasingly serving as a resource for legislators interested in drafting legislation or who just want our perspective on pending legislation. Overall, and most importantly, increasingly, we're being included as a full system partner in broader policy discussions. The state created a Criminal Justice Coordinating Council a couple of years ago, and the executive order creating the council specifically has a seat for the public defender on both the executive committee and the full council. We are also well represented on the committee implementing the National Institute of Corrections Evidence-Based Decision-Making grant that was awarded just a couple of months ago. So all that sounds great, but not everything is perfect, of course. There are still challenges we're working on. Wisconsin has the lowest hourly rate of reimbursement in the nation for private bar payments. and I keep and maintain an ever-growing list of legislative wish list items. Our general approach to advocacy, I'm sorry, I flipped a little too early. So I started in 2011, roughly the same time as our current public defender, though she had been in the agency for a while before that. We have taken a very deliberative and strategic approach to outreach, and that doesn't mean to imply slow reaction time. The legislative process can, at times, move through an issue as quickly as an initial appearance docket. But we do think through the issues and determine whether they need a response and what level of response is appropriate. And when not dealing with an immediate issue, spend time meeting with legislators and staff to build a relationship that can be called upon later. We always look for other opportunities to advance policy priorities and establish relationships kind of outside what people might normally expect. So I'm going to do kind of 5 top tips for effective advocacy. In general, a lot of my suggestions have been covered in the prior 2 webinars in this series, and I encourage you to watch those. But some of these points are worth reiterating. Before I get into the tips themselves, I want to go through a few themes that will come out among all of them. The first theme is preparation. Benjamin Franklin once said, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. I really got to know that when I worked as a clerk for a state senate committee. I found that for every hour of a public hearing, it took nearly 8 hours of preparation. And that was a good lesson for being a successful advocate for the SPD, that preparation is key. One of the other themes is that lawmaking does not equate to the practice of law, especially in the criminal area. This applies both to the understanding, or perhaps lack thereof at times, on the part of lawmakers as to the practical application of the laws they pass, and to practicing attorneys who sometimes have a hard time understanding how or why a law was written the way it is. When it comes to policy and budget advocacy, being right on the law does not equate to being successful. The third theme is balancing being a government agency with being a criminal defense law firm. This is probably the root cause of a majority of the internal discussions in our agency on how to proceed on a particular issue or policy. Even in Wisconsin, where the independence of Principle 1 is pretty well enumerated, balance needs to be taken into account. Policymakers, in my general experience, are relatively understanding of the need for a zealous defense in individual cases. It's when an issue goes beyond an individual case that consideration needs to be given to the balance. Fourth theme is everything relates, and I can't emphasize this enough. Policy advocacy has to take into account an interconnectedness that may at times be unapparent. The high-profile case in a legislator's district, the offhand comment to a local judge, the need to advocate for or against a policy. All of these things have the ability to impact the resources or practice of the public defender's office. Fifth theme is kind of taking a nonpartisan approach to advocacy and a bipartisan approach to the issues. Obviously, politics plays a large role when dealing with policymakers, but that does not mean that public defenders doing advocacy should express a partisan viewpoint. Support for a public defender agency does not need to be limited to one party or another. This means making the effort to identify and highlight the reason that a lawmaker of one party or another should support a particular issue. An example is providing adequate resources, whether funding to use private bar attorneys or sufficient staff attorneys to maintain controlled workloads as called for in ADA Principle 5. A Democrat may prefer to focus on providing adequate resources because of the moral argument that a public defense system serves as the front line of checking the nearly unfettered power of the government to investigate and prosecute crime, and how that can have a huge impact on the lives of indigent defendants, even if they're ultimately not convicted. A Republican may be swayed by a more fiscal argument that, for instance, hiring more staff attorneys is a more fiscally prudent way of ensuring that the state meets its constitutional burden to provide counsel. A libertarian may focus mostly on the fact that an adequately funded public defender system is called for in the Sixth Amendment and under Gideon. So now to the tips themselves. Tip number 1 is to build and maintain relationships. This is a large part of preparation. Several of the presenters in the prior webinar episodes have touched on this topic, but it bears reiterating. Building relationships can focus on when a new legislature is sworn in. We set up meetings with new members, especially those who have indicated an interest in criminal justice issues. Many may not be aware of anything beyond the existence of a public defender system. And it's important also not to ignore people who may be assumed to be natural allies. Often they may be better advocates if they have more current information and a chance to connect with you. Also, be proactive in establishing new relationships. Though natural allies may reach out, it's highly unlikely that a new legislator will go beyond consulting with the Department of Justice or their hometown prosecutor or judge if they haven't heard from you before. It's also important to maintain relationships. Given that when there is not a pending issue, make sure to talk to legislators and staff, even if it's just stopping by to say hi. Sometimes stopping by to say hi is relieving to a legislator or staffer who is used to people only visiting when there's an immediate need. You never know when a casual conversation can result in hearing about an issue or pending bill that may impact your agency or lead to a conversation about a topic you might not normally have met with them on specifically. Maintaining relationships also means periodically meeting with experienced policymakers as well. I want to take just a second to make a special note about legislative staff and their importance in the system. It's really advantageous to treat them virtually the same as the legislator themselves. Staff often knows as much, if not more, than the legislator, especially on process questions, as the legislator may not be in the Capitol to the same extent as staff. To a large degree, they control access to the legislator. If staff doesn't want to accommodate a scheduling request, your advocacy may not even get the chance to be effective. In a lot of capitals, staff may continue to work on in the legislative branch even after their particular legislator has left. So they may be more willing to give practically useful information than the legislator. Collaboration with partners is important. Building relationships isn't limited to policymakers. Under the Everything Relates theme, reaching out to new non-traditional partners can sometimes pay dividends. We've been fortunate to have built many strong relationships with other state and local criminal justice system partner agencies so that if they hear of an issue, they'll relate it to us. And they may also suggest to legislators that the legislators should reach out to us, see if what they're working on may impact the SPD. We definitely stay in close touch with the Department of Justice, Department of Corrections, the court system, our counties association, key circuit court judges, and outside policy groups. There's also an internal component to this concept, which is that local staff, as we're a statewide system, we have staff that cover all 72 counties, though we only have offices in about half the counties. Local staff can be effective in talking to their hometown legislator, but also in terms of giving you a good perspective on the current local practice. Tip number 2 is approach and messaging. And this shares a lot of similarities with the previous point about building and maintaining relationships, and is probably more of a messaging point. A trap that I think public defenders sometimes fall into when dealing with policymakers is to focus solely on the shortcomings of the public defender model in their jurisdiction. Inadequate or disparate funding, crushing caseloads, systems stacked against our clients, etc. And all of these are obviously legitimate and urgent issues. But when presented in the negative, a policymaker only hears that they are supposed to reprioritize resources on what, if we're really being honest with ourselves, is not the most popular or politically expedient program operated by a state or local government. After all, no politician has ever campaigned primarily on the issue of public defender resources. It can be exceedingly difficult to focus on the positive, but wherever possible, we seek to put things in a positive light. This also correlates to celebrating successes, no matter how small. And it gives policymakers a chance to continue to build on past success. So one example is during the 2015 budget, the governor included 26 new staff attorney positions. The reasoning was that by increasing staff attorneys, which are still cheaper than a private bar appointment, there could be a net fiscal decrease to the agency and taxpayers. At the same time, and for almost the last decade, prosecutors statewide have been arguing that they are dramatically understaffed. They had requested 100 new positions and received none in the budget. Needless to say, they expressed their displeasure with that disparity when talking with their legislators. For us, it would have been tempting and easier to tell legislators that our added positions save taxpayer money, whereas adding prosecutors does nothing but increase costs. The better message was to say that we agree that prosecutors are understaffed, which to us means that they may not have the resources to participate in Wisconsin's robust treatment court system. Combined with the fiscal savings concept and leaving out the message about prosecutors being a cost upper only, this resonated with legislators who, with just a very few questions, approved the additional staffing positions. Tip number 3 is responsivity. Being responsive is a key factor. Pretty much the only professional contact more important than my boss, hello Kelly, is a call from a legislator or staff. A request from a legislator trumps any other work I may be doing. Even if the request is difficult, whether just technically hard to answer or uncomfortable to answer, one of the things that will annoy a legislator of any party is a lack of response whatsoever. There's also the potential that you've been given an opportunity to weigh in early in the process and can influence future decision-making on the issue if you respond before your prosecutor or judge. This is another case of success breeding success. If a legislator is successful in getting a prompt and, of course, accurate and persuasive response, they are more likely to reach out on other issues. There's two kind of sub-themes to this tip. First, be succinct. Legislators don't always have the time or ability to have a broad, free-ranging discussion about public defender issues. Ask the specific question, provide a specific answer. Of course, that doesn't mean ignore important related issues, which they still should consider. But if you find yourself saying on another topic, do a mental check on whether they really need to hear that topic immediately. Also, read body language. If there's a lot going on in the Capitol that day, don't try to fit in more than they have time for. And the second sub-theme is the magical phrase, I don't know. Don't be afraid to say you don't know something, but we'll follow up. This can be most obviously used when you truly don't know the answer to their question. Worse than trying to be responsive is being responsive with inaccurate information. Better to follow up in a timely manner, of course. I don't know can also be a useful tool if you're unsure if there's subtext to the question and you just want some time to give a more carefully considered answer. This is also useful if the body language says they're mentally moving on to the next meeting. The fourth tip is credibility. One of the most precious commodities in the advocacy community is credibility. Without it, there is no chance to make your case or be persuasive even if you get the chance. Credibility can be established by following the prior key points to successful advocacy. Building relationships, avoiding the sky is falling approach, and being responsive. The final tip is strategy. And this is another topic that can impact credibility, but also should play a role in your approach to policymakers. First, for the future of your agency, take time to consider longer-term policy issues. If you have a clear understanding of what your system needs, it will make it easier to understand the issues in the short term and be aware of how everything relates. Popular refrain in criminal justice reform discussions is using a healthcare model of evidence-based decision-making. To piggyback on that, I offer the theory of triaging issues. Decide which issues are really worth engaging on and be critical in your analysis. Think of your ability to weigh in as measured in political capital. For issues where you have concerns, first consider whether the issue is truly one in which you want to spend that capital. If it is, determine what you want the outcome to be. Do you want the bill totally killed? Can it be mitigated with changes? And how much capital you need to spend to achieve that desired outcome. It costs more to take a public position than it does to work behind the scenes. And working behind the scenes is only possible if you have the established relationships, appropriate message, and credibility to be effective. If there's something that you can be positive on, do so and be public about it. In this case, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. If a policy is 90% good, or whatever threshold you're comfortable with, make your support known. The more public your support, the more capital you'll earn. This is also an opportunity to demonstrate that you can celebrate successes and have a positive message. I want to talk about this in kind of a real-world example in a case study of the difference between the 2013 budget and the 2015 budget. I'll give, hopefully, as brief a summary of the Wisconsin budgeting process as I can. Wisconsin operates on a biennial budget which starts July 1st of the odd-numbered year and covers 2 fiscal years. The most recent budget, covering 2015-17, had total spending of nearly $73 billion. Total funding for the public defender was approved at just under $173 million, or about 1/4% of total state spending. Beginning around January of the even-numbered year, staff starts putting together information for the next budget. It's then presented to our board, which ultimately approves it, and it gets submitted to the governor's office in mid-September of the even-numbered year. The governor and administration then review requests and consider their own initiatives. In this window, we'll generally meet with the governor's office anywhere between 2 and 5 times or more to describe what we've submitted, answer their questions, and provide follow-up information on any of the governor's initiatives. We also meet with legislative leaders to give them an idea of what we've submitted and to lay the groundwork for further contacts once the budget is formally introduced. And we take the time to meet with staff in the budget office of both the administration and the legislature. In late February of the odd-numbered year, the governor introduces the bill and it's off to the races. Over the next month or so, people review it and prepare summaries. And we review the budget for not only what's ultimately included for us, but for other items within DOJ, DOC, Department of Health Services, courts, which may impact our operations or client representation. We meet with all members of the legislature's Joint Committee on Finance to brief them on the budget and get an initial impression of their position on our items. The committee then holds a series of public hearings throughout the state, and depending on what is in our budget and what we might need our messaging to be, we may actually ask staff in local offices to go and attend those meetings. By April of the odd year, the committee starts voting. We do another round of meetings with the committee members, and I continue to follow up with staff with increasing frequency the closer to the day of the committee vote we get. And the closer we get, the more direct I get in asking what their position is. It's at this point, it's especially important to have already established relationships. Everyone working on the committee is extremely busy. The ability to stop in and have a productive conversation in 2 minutes or less is vital. Once the committee has finished its work, we review where we stand and have an opportunity to seek changes for the legislature. Throughout the process, we also make sure to inform managers and local staff of the status of the budget. And keeping staff informed not only reduces the anxiety for them, but it occasionally prompts local staff to pass along information they may have heard in a legislator's home district. So if you're doing the math in all, it's about 18 months from the first action on the budget until it's signed into law. There was an interesting contrast in the difference of approach between the 2013 and 2015 budgets. In 2013, there were several key provisions in the governor's budget which we were supportive of and asked for legislative approval. One of those was the pay progression system I mentioned earlier. We worked collaboratively with DOJ and the ADA group to contact legislators, and all of us were told the committee supported the provision, but on the day of the vote, they opted for an alternative that looked good on paper, but missed the point of the policy in the first place. We all had to work overtime, including one now infamous incident, which may or may not have involved a group effort to commit a breaking and entering on a Sunday morning to get to the legislative fiscal analysts. In the end, we were successful in restoring the original budget item, but it took intensive daily work to get it done. By contrast, in 2015, we had 3 good provisions in the governor's office. Early on, it was obvious that there was sincere support for the budget as drafted. Also working in our favor was that there was virtually no focus on the criminal justice system. Time and again, we were told that if we weren't there on education or roads, we should just move along. But after verifying that this was accurate, we took the position of staying behind the scenes, out of sight, out of mind. Ultimately, the committee approved a good budget for us, but in comparison to 2013, legislative contact was significantly lower. This did result in some pretty nice recognition. In his floor speech, the chair of the Finance Committee summarized highlights from the budget and included the additional staff attorneys provision, commenting that they are working to ensure Wisconsin is providing its constitutional right to counsel. So I think this is my last slide, I promise, Michelle. How can this apply to you? First, get a meeting. But seriously, I realize resources aren't there, particularly for county-based defender systems, but at a minimum, identify a person in addition to the chief public defender to serve as a primary point of contact for policymakers. The more that that person's position can be dedicated to full-time advocacy, the more benefit you'll get. And this person can help with responsivity and credibility. Also, take time to assess your current situation. Identify the current status of your relationships. Who are your champions? Do you have people who could use more time and attention? Identify some new people or groups to reach out to. And in this, be creative and open to new directions. As far as establishing relationships, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Critically analyze your general approach to messaging. Are there areas of success you could highlight? If you don't have in-house expertise, see if there's a local PR firm that may be willing to donate a day's worth of time to help. Without getting debilitatingly formal, institute some process to review agency strategy. First, look at a long-term strategy. Plan out the next 2 to 5 years or more into the future. And in this, involve a broad group of agency staff, private partners, and other criminal justice system partners. And look at your short-term strategy. Be able to act quickly and make decisions on what, if any, action you want to take. So with that, I will wrap it up and move along to Manisha Sums.
Hi, Adam. Before you do that, I do have a couple of questions for you. Basically, you went through a lot of information and tips, and because of your expertise, I think a lot of people benefit from all of that. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have a you, and for those of us who don't have a you, don't have an Adam, and I know you work very closely with your chief, Kelly Thompson, on these issues. And I know she's a very busy person. So if you have, very limited time with her, and if there's just, 2 things that you would like your chief to be able to do, and say if they don't have a you, and there are 2 things that the chief needs to do in order to effective advocacy, what are those 2 things you think?
If what you're going to do is kind of focus on 2 things for a chief defender who obviously has other demands on their time and you don't have an Adam in your agency, and this can apply whether you're a county-based system, statewide, whatever, the 2 bare minimum things to do are dedicate time after an election cycle to establishing relationships. You can, depending on the size of the legislative body that you have to interact with, just take a couple of weeks, a month, even if it's up to a couple months, to get through and meet with those people. If you establish that relationship, if you take that time at the beginning, it makes it easier later on when you're still taking cases, when you're still managing your staff, when that immediate issue comes up, You already know that person. They already know you. It only takes you a half-hour meeting to get through something rather than an hour. The second thing is focus on the budget cycle, whether it's county budget, a state budget, whatever. It's worth taking time away to pay particular attention during the budget development so that you get your important points into the executive branch and while the legislative branch considers it, just so that can set so many of your priorities and cover such a wide area, it's worth carving out time specifically for those.
I do have another question. It's been very exciting watching or hearing what's going on in Wisconsin, particularly in this last budget session, where you did have success in getting awarded funds for 26 additional attorneys and some IT support money. But can you briefly tell us what are some of the barriers or some of the negativity that was maybe around some of those additions to the public defender office? How did the private assigned counsel bar respond to that, and what were some of those issues, and how did you work with them to smooth some of those things over?
There actually was another provision that the governor originally included in his budget, adding a separate conflict of interest office to the agency, and this is a concept that's come up a number of times in the last 15 or 16 years. And it would have set up a totally separate office in the most populous area of the state, staffed by, still it would have been staff attorneys, but they kind of would have been firewalled off from the remainder of the agency. The private bar partners were a little bit more concerned about that provision than adding the staff attorneys, primarily because conflict of interest generates so many appointments, but also because the 26 attorneys, I think, were more dispersed. You know, with 72 counties, it means local pockets of private bar throughout the state weren't going to see as much of a decrease in appointments as the private bar in that one specific area may have. So we talked to them extensively. We stayed in touch. I went to a meeting of the Wisconsin Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers board and kind of talked about how things were progressing. In general, we have a good and collaborative relationship with them. We definitely see the private bar as our business partners, and we want them to be successful. We need them to be successful for the clients. So there were concerns. There was negativity. I think what we tried to do was maintain that relationship, kind of focus on how everything related within the budget, and to have a more positive focus on how things may practically impact them versus a first blush reaction.
Great. I think that people want to hear those challenges. Time at the end, we can certainly discuss that a bit further. For right now, we're going to turn the conversation over to Monisha Sum from Spitfire Strategies, who can talk about some messaging strategies and tips for those of us who are operating without an ATOM. So, Monisha, if you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle, both for having me and for turning it over. As Michelle mentioned, I am a vice president at Spitfire Strategies. I work on messaging and communication planning for nonprofits and foundations. Specifically, I've had a lot of experience working with the defender community with previous work through NLADA, Open Society Foundations, an organization called Gideon's Promise, and a few other groups. So I know that there are, special challenges and special considerations that this community is really focused on when it comes to effective communication. So a lot of things that Adam talked about are exactly the types of tips that, I am presenting. Thinking through the strategy to effectively communicate really involves careful consideration and the time to understand who you're communicating to, what you want to accomplish, and what you're going to say to those people. So I wanted to give you some practical tips to help organize a lot of the ideas and examples that Adam walked us through. So the idea here is that to effectively persuade your audience to do something, to advocate, whether it's for your budget, a budget increase, or another issue that you're working on, you want to map out a strategy. And you want to really think through what it is that you want to get done and the steps in order to achieve that goal. So when we're thinking about how you are defining what that goal is, you really want to be sure, we call this a SMART test, to make sure that you're defining what that is up front and that everyone's on the same page. You want to make sure that this objective that you set is specific, so everyone knows exactly what it is. So this could be that you want to pass a legislative policy that increases your funding by 10% or by a certain amount within the next term. So you want to think about that specificity, how you're going to measure it, so what that amount would be. What do you want to increase it by? You want to make sure that that objective that you're setting or goal that you have is attainable, and that means that you are looking at your own capacity. So we talked about, whether you have an Adam on your staff or not. Is it really possible within your capacity to really get this done within this time frame? You want to just make sure that you're planning not idealistically, but practically. And the second part of that is making sure that your objective is realistic, and that means taking a look outside of your capacity to the real world, thinking about, what is the legislative climate or the political climate on this issue. Maybe we can't, maybe it's not realistic to get this bill passed. Maybe we need to think about what that first step is and getting that done this year. So whether it's securing a champion to be a sponsor, for example, maybe that's the first step, and that's much more realistic. You really want to just make sure that you're thinking about what you want to get done deliberately. The last piece of the SMART test is time-bound. So the idea here is that if you say, we want to increase funding generally, of course everyone wants to do that, but you want to really think through how you can measure your progress, because that will help you decide, if we want to get this done this year or if we want to get this done in 2 years, it's a different allocation of your resources, a different speed of your strategy. So you really want to make sure that you're thinking through all of these points when you're figuring out what your goal is. And I have here, there's different ways of setting your goals. So it can be behavior change goals. So you want people to do something differently. It could be policy goals, which is much more, directly related to what we're talking about today and what you might be focusing on. So this is where you're thinking about a bill that you might want to pass or a bill that you might want to stop from passing, thinking about that traditional advocacy. It could also be a fundraising goal. And again, your fundraising goal is sometimes your policy goal. But sometimes some organizations, across the board have other ways of raising funds, and so you might want to be thinking about that. The point is that no matter what you're trying to get done, you really want to think through how you're going to measure your progress. Setting a measurable objective is the only way you can tell in 3 months, in 6 months, in 9 months, how close you're getting to that goal. Otherwise, you can't tell unless you succeed or fail, in which case you may have used a lot of resources to something that wasn't effective. So once you have a sense of what you want to do, you need to think about who you're targeting. So we have here, this diagram shows, growing circles. The idea is that you first want to identify exactly who your decision maker is. At the end of the day, who is saying yes or no to this policy that you want to, have passed, for example. Is it that the governor needs to sign a bill? Is it that actually it's not there yet? What we first need to do is focus on a specific committee within the legislature. And then you need to think about who you have access to and who's influential. So sometimes you have direct access to the decision maker. For example, if you're trying to pass a bill in the Senate, we work with death penalty advocates who a few years ago were trying to pass a bill through the federal Senate to allow for DNA testing for anyone who is accused of a capital offense. So we knew that the Senate Judiciary Chair was the core decision maker, but they also knew that they didn't have direct access to the Senate Judiciary Chair. So we thought about who do you have access to that can then influence that decision maker. So your decision maker could be a person, it could be a group, it could be a body, a committee. You want to think about, though, how specific you can get. Saying all of Congress is really hard to effectively communicate to. You want to narrow it down as much as possible and then think about those other audiences. So for this example, they didn't have access to the Senate Judiciary Chair, so we thought about who they did have access to who also would influence that decision maker. And they ended up targeting one of their audiences was the Association of Counties committee member, who they had access to and they also knew could influence their ultimate decision maker. So one thing I think about sometimes when I'm working on audience segmenting is, who is persuadable? That is also influential with the decision maker. So I try to sometimes put them in categories of the saints, the people who are already on your side, that you want to shore up and keep on your side, but you don't have to dedicate most of your resources to communicating to the people who already agree with you. Then there are the sinners, the ones who are never going to agree with you no matter what you do. As much as you communicate to them, they're publicly against you, they're staunch opponents. And so it's not necessarily effective to use the bulk of your communications targeting them. So who you want to focus on is what we call the salvageables, the people who either haven't taken a stance or might be on the fence, might be persuadable. Again, so that you're really targeting your resources to have the greatest effect. So the next thing you want to think about when you're working on communicating to those audiences, so once you think through who you're going to target, you want to think about how you're going to communicate to them effectively, what your messaging is going to be. And so the main tip here I have is it's really important to understand your audience and where they're coming from, rather than starting from where you're coming from and what you want them to agree with. You really want to think about where your audience is in terms of how they can be persuaded. So we think about this at Spitfire in 3 different stages. So if you're sharing knowledge with your audience, that means that they don't know the information, that they just don't understand the impact, or the facts. This is where you want to share research, where you want to show your statistics, because they don't either have the information, they don't care about it, and you want to get them to care about the issue in the first place before they can, take a stance and do something. Or they don't believe you, in which case, again, you have to build your case that this is an important issue and that you are right on this issue. The second stage where your audience might be is they know about it and, they might know that you're right, but they don't necessarily, they're not taking action. So this is where you really need to figure out, why aren't we getting traction? Is it because of the political climate and there are specific barriers that our audiences have to moving forward? Is it, that they don't feel comfortable taking a public stand and we have to work on their comfort level? You need to think about what barriers are holding them back and why they aren't doing something. Again, rather than thinking about it from your perspective and why you just want them to do something. The most important tip here is to understand that it's not always just sharing more and more information. Sometimes you've shared enough information, but something is still holding them back, and you have to figure out what that is. I have here one tip that is thinking about making the rewards bigger than the risk. You want to think through what your audience cares about, what's holding them back, and sometimes there is this understanding or this perception that what you're asking them to do comes with some risk, whether it's political risk, perception risk. You want to think about how can I convince my audience, my decision maker, that what I'm asking them to do is worth it, whatever that risk or concern that they have might be. So that worth it might be that you are providing political support and cover, rallying your allies in support of them so that they don't feel, threatened by coming out in favor of your, your position. You want to think about what those different things are that you can do to create that bridge to your audience. And the last piece is something Adam already touched on, which is this making sure that you are celebrating your wins and really thanking your, decision maker, the person you're trying to persuade, so that they will then do something again. You're never going to, run out of things that you want to get done. So in order to keep those people on your side, you need to acknowledge their work. So a couple of quick things to think about when you are working on messaging for your audience. You want to know who your audience is. You want to know what you want them to do. Be really clear about what that ask is that you're trying to get them to do. You want to think about what they care about. Again, not what you care about, but what they care about and how you can connect that to your issue. And then you want to think about what their reason to say no is, because that's what you're going to have to address when you work on messaging. So when it comes to audience values and tapping that through messaging, Adam walked through some really good examples of this. And the takeaways there from what he was saying, I think, are that you really want to think about what their existing values are. What do they care about right now that you can access or connect to with your issue and what you're trying to move? Versus what can you make them care about, or what do you want them to care about? I have this picture of a frog up because we work with a lot of environmental organizations, and we worked with one a few years back that was trying to stop the expansion of an airport because it was going to kill off a species of frog in the area. And we did some research, and we found out that this was a ballot initiative. And so we found out that the voters there were actually against this airport expansion because they were worried about traffic and noise, that it would really hinder their commute. So instead of, doing a campaign that focused on reinforcing or emphasizing this problem of traffic and noise, the environmental group said, no, we want them to do it for the frog. And so the lesson there is that, you care about the frog, your frog, whatever that is. They don't necessarily care about the frog. You don't need them to always care about the frog. You need them to stop the airport expansion. And so, you don't want to undermine your own values and, lean into something that is in conflict with what you believe in, but you also don't necessarily need to just hammer home or continuously, try and get your audience to see things the way you do. You want to think about how you can get them to do what you want. The other thing to think about with values is just thinking about big values versus small values. So the idea here is that sometimes people do things because it's fair, and sometimes people do things because it's convenient. You want to think about those everyday, closer to home values that you can tap into with your audience. So just one example of thinking about different values, we worked on a campaign many of you might be familiar with to stop the predatory rates in prison for people to communicate with their families. So the value here that they could have communicated what could have been fairness. They could have really talked about how this is unfair, and it's a justice thing. It's about, this sort of big value. Instead, they really thought about who their audience was and how they could connect to them, and they started talking about families and how it's really important for families to connect. So this is an example of a Mother's Day campaign. And this was just talking about the same issue but through a different lens. And so you want to think about what lens is going to be most effective for your audience. The last tip on values and barriers is just that when you're thinking about the barriers that your audience has, sometimes they're factual barriers, but sometimes they're emotional barriers, especially when it comes to issues around public safety, you know, whether your audience believes it or is saying it in a political sense. This is an area, field that has a lot of emotion connected to it, people's feeling of safety, people feeling, you know, things are right or wrong. And so you want to acknowledge that you're not just able to rattle off a series of facts in order to be persuasive. You have to at least acknowledge that there are these emotions involved and that sometimes people are coming at an issue or at your campaign from that perspective. And sometimes those emotions are not what they are saying. So you want to read between the lines, really try and understand what exactly is holding these people back and how we're going to communicate with them. So when you're thinking about messaging, one other tip to think about is sometimes you're the right messenger. Sometimes you're the person who needs to be advocating on your behalf directly. But sometimes that's not true, or sometimes it's you and other people. So you want to think about who you need to speak on your behalf or on behalf of the issue. So is this the people that you're working with, the actual people that you're defending? Is it their family members? Is it allies, you know, other nonprofit organizations that come at things from different perspectives? This is an example of Bud Welch, whose daughter was killed in the Oklahoma City bombings. And Bud was staunchly in favor of the death penalty and did, you know, speak out initially for the death penalty for Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. But actually, over time, he changed. This experience he went through changed his mind about a lot of things, and he is now a public advocate against the death penalty. So this is just one example of a really effective messenger who might be more effective than, you know, than a public defender would be in talking about this issue, or an advocate would be. You just want to think a little bit outside the box when you're thinking about your messengers. So I'm going to really quickly walk through our format for putting together an effective message. This is something that you can use. You don't have to use it, but it's a tool. You know, Adam was talking a lot about not having a lot of time for these things, and in my experience, having some sort of tool or format is a great way to really make sure that you're able to quickly but effectively plan your communications. So this is basically a compilation of all the things that we talked about in a message. The first point of your message box should be something that you are saying that connects to the value of your audience, something that gets them nodding and agreeing with them. So if they care about money, you're talking about how, you know, we need more cost-effective approaches that's going to save the state X billion dollars. Then you want to think about, okay, I've identified their barrier. This is my point, this is my message point that is going to overcome that barrier. It's going to address their concerns so that they don't worry about it anymore, or, you know, I'm mitigating their concerns. Then you move around to this specific ask. So this is pass this bill, or vote on this, or, you know, sign this petition. Whatever it is, it's very clear. They know what you want them to do. That's the only way they can, you know, the thing that I would just really caution you against is saying support us. Because it's very easy for me to sit here and support you all day long while I'm doing 100 other things. That's not going to help you. You want to really have an ask that you're clear what the outcome is. The last piece of your message box is a vision. So this is where you say, what's going to happen if you do what I ask? So let me show you a quick example. This is the message box that we used with the example I mentioned earlier about passing DNA testing for anyone accused of a capital crime. So they were talking to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they specifically were talking to Catholic members of the Judiciary Committee because they wanted to tap the value of fairness. And so their value message was innocent people should not be wrongfully convicted and sentenced to die. This is something that they started a conversation. People, yes, that's true. Not a lot of disagreement with that. So the barrier that this audience had, and we found this through research, was that they didn't think people were being sentenced to die who were innocent. So the barrier message addressed that fact. More than 100 have since 1976. So this was a factual barrier that they had, and the facts helped to address that. So the ask is very clear, provide DNA testing, and the vision is, again, what's going to happen if we do this? And that's, we're going to have a more fair justice system. The thing here is that you want to be aspirational. You don't want to say, you know, because you can quibble with this vision statement and say, well, our justice system certainly isn't fair now, which is true, but you're not going to motivate people to do anything unless you're aspirational and visionary and really trying to show them the progress you're going to make. So one, I skipped over this slide. I'm going to go back to it. This is just an example of, you know, what happens if you repeat the barrier in your message. So this is a quote that says, a lot of people think that the benefit of funding the public defenders is for the bad guys, and nobody wants to help the bad guys. And then he continues to talk about his point. So right there, you are, you know, this quote reinforces this perception that you're helping bad guys. The recommendation I would have is, for this example, just start the quote with the problem is that it helps all of us. So you really want to think about making sure that you're not repeating your audience's barrier when you're putting together a message. So last couple of tips when it comes to messaging is to really think about some things to avoid. So the first is MIGO. In case if anyone doesn't know what this means, this is the only acronym that we use here at Spitfire. It stands for My Eyes Glaze Over. It's really important to try and strip your messaging of jargon and acronyms. The reason is because people don't understand you. People who don't understand you won't ask you to clarify most of the time. Either you won't have time, or it's because people do not like to seem dumb, so they don't often ask clarifying questions. This isn't always the case, but you don't want to waste your time having to define a lot of your terms or having people potentially misunderstand what you're trying to say. You want to be really clear and consistent with your messaging and just make sure that everyone can understand what you're trying to get across. The next sin to avoid is having too much information. So I talked a little bit about those stages of persuasion, and sometimes just throwing statistics at people and throwing information at people, it just overloads their brain with information and it isn't persuasive. You want to think again about focusing in on what it is that your audience cares the most about and having your message be on that, rather than sharing every single thing you know about a topic or about this issue and hoping that one of those things is persuasive to them. The next sin to avoid when you're messaging is creating a math problem. So this is tied to too much information. You really want to be very careful and strategic with your use of statistics and numbers in your messaging, just because too many numbers really just confuse people. They'll be working on figuring out if percentages are big or small rather than what your message is saying. And the last a really important piece of messaging is to make sure that you always have stories and narratives in your communications. You want to be telling the stories of the people whose lives are affected rather than making this about facts and figures. So those are some tips when it comes to audience targeting and messaging. You know, we have a tool called a Smart Chart. So if you go to smartchart.org, you can actually download a full chart to help you think through this process. You know, I think the big takeaway here is that you can actually do this pretty quickly and effectively if you have a process and an organized way to think about it. So let me now turn the mic over to Michelle.
Thank you, Monisha. I do have some questions.
Great.
I think another big takeaway of your presentation is, and I'm going to use this, we don't need them to care about the frog. I think that's very important. You know, the focus should be getting the decision maker to do what we want. And that opens the door to a lot of different strategies and not just one approach to presenting different narratives, not just one narrative. And I think that sometimes, at least for defenders, it may not be the lack of narrative, but the attempt to change the narrative that some people have about public defense. And you have some suggestions on how we can sort of change that narrative.
I think the most important thing there is to really do your research on your audience and understand what that is. You know, we sometimes think about things really broadly, about criminal justice really generally, but you want to figure out what's the conversation about this particular issue and what is that narrative. So figuring that out first, and then figuring out, okay, this is working, this could work if we emphasize this aspect of it. Or this is entirely the wrong conversation to have. We need to turn it to this. And once you know what this is that you want to change it to, if we're talking a lot about, you know, making sure that criminals are behind bars and public safety in sort of a fear-mongering way, and you want to have a conversation about public safety, making sure we're putting the right people behind bars, that is a way, then that changes the direction of your messaging and what you want to consistently get out. The other thing I think is really thinking as you're trying to change the narrative. Adam talked a lot about relationships, and it's really important to build up the ladder of relationships, and so you can slowly evolve your narrative.
I would like to invite our participants, if you have any questions, to please feel free to type them in, and we can make sure that the panelists get those questions. Meanwhile, I do have another question for you, Monisha. You talk about the 4 sins of messaging in that slide. I kept that slide up there for a reason. Is there a sin that lawyers tend to commit the most or more so than the others?
I think that it straddles between the me-go and too much information. You know, there's lawyer speak, and sometimes that's appropriate. If you are communicating with other lawyers, then you don't, it's not about dumbing it down, it's about being clear. And so if you're communicating with an audience that understands what you're talking about in the words that you use, that's fine. But if there's any concern that you have a different definition for a term than someone else does, that's where you can run into problems.
Adam, I don't know if you could still join us visually, but if not visually, please turn your mic on in response to some of these questions. And I will address you. Great. So we talked about, Monisha talked about having a messenger, and sometimes we use the term ambassador to sort of spread our message. Adam, if you could talk about if your office uses other messengers, like committee members or other stakeholders that you use to help message for you.
Sure, yeah, actually that's one of our most common approaches. For instance, if there's a bill that we're testifying on at a public committee hearing, which is obviously, as I talked about, you got to give that thought to how much do you want to be involved and how much capital do you want to spend on an issue. But if there is something that's come to the point that we're testifying at a public hearing, generally a model that works pretty well for us is teaming up. I will come with an attorney from our office who either is a specialist in that area, or we also have in the last year, 18 months, established a number of practice groups. Each of those groups is headed by a coordinator. They deal with juvenile law, termination of parental rights issues, forensics, homicide, that kind of stuff. If it falls within one of those areas, the two of us will come together and testify. And like what Monisha was talking about with lawyer speak, I generally will kick off our testimony with kind of a, here's what we're going to say in plain terms, in more policymaker speak, and then turn it over to the legal expert, who then is free to do a little bit more lawyer speak. And then, you know, we're better able to cover all the bases, and it may be a bit pejorative, but all lawmakers, whether they're lawyers or not, kind of fancy themselves a lawyer. So they kind of like to hear from and be able to attempt to engage in a dialogue with a legal expert on the issues they're working on. So that's one strategy that's been pretty successful for us.
And Monisha, do you recommend that people, when they're trying to solicit messengers, that they, you know, prepare materials and have one consistent message and sort of train the messengers without really telling them that you're training them, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. So, you know, I have found that people like help. You know, you want to think about, and no one likes to be told what to do or lectured at, but people really appreciate support. You know, you're all very busy at your jobs and appreciate the support of having tools and tips and all of that, and your messengers are going to be the same way. You know, if you're working with people who agree with you, but this is not their profession, it's not their job, they're not an expert, having, you know, easy to understand fact sheets, or, you know, having messages that are similar, consistent with your messages, but maybe tailored to their perspective. So you're talking about it from your angle of being a public defender. They're talking about it from their angle of being a family member. You know, they're able to maybe hit a different value than you are, but the theme or the conversation that you're having is consistent.
And I have seen that done effectively before some city and county councils, where you'll have different messengers, whether it be from different advocacy organizations or community members, where they give their different values or different perspectives, but they have the same ask. And that ask is hammered home again and again and again and again, and seen that used effectively. One more quick question to both of you. Your opinions on the use of social media in your advocacy campaigns. Yes, no, in the middle, both of you.
So I'll just, from a general perspective, there's no yes or no for any of these tactics. It's all, you know, not to be repeating myself, but it's really all about the strategy. If your audiences are on social media and they're engaging in a conversation, you first want to start with listening. So, you know, get on social media and understand what that conversation is before you just jump out with a tweet. You want to figure out what social media platform they're on. So, you know, I would imagine that most of these high-level policy conversations are on Twitter versus Facebook. It's just, you know, tends to be that way for these platforms. They're probably not Instagramming pictures, you know, unless there's something big happening at Supreme Court. But you want to figure out what that platform is, listen to the conversation for a while, and then be really strategic in, you know, it could be that you are starting by retweeting good posts from your allies, or retweeting a policymaker who says something that supports, you know, your stance, and you retweet them with a comment saying, you know, this is so great, so that you're building that relationship that way on Twitter as well as in person. And then once you get comfortable with it, you can start posting, maybe it's you're posting an article and making a comment about how it connects to your issue. So you want to think about the value add that social media can offer you, rather than just do it because everyone seems to be doing it.
I would agree with a lot of what Monisha just said. I tend to look at social media in the way I approach my job as a way to focus on what is it that the legislature or a particular legislator are paying attention to, what are the issues that they care most about. I use it more as a monitoring tool than an engagement tool. And keep in mind, even if you do want to establish a Twitter account, our relatively new Attorney General is a prolific tweeter. absolutely does not take the place of building relationships. It can serve a purpose in maintaining them, but nothing will ever take the place of having a good old-fashioned sit-down meeting to get to know someone.
And the last thing I would just say is you really want to make sure that you know what your office's social media policy is. You know, most likely they hopefully have one, you know, that talks about the comfort level of things that you are allowed to say and not allowed to say. If you don't have one, then that's something that you want to encourage people to develop, so that you're not, you know, ever in conflict with policies.
Very good points from both of you. Thank you so very much. And thank you so very much for agreeing to present on this webinar. I think we got some very valuable tips and tools from both of you. Again, thank you. And I want to let all of our viewers know that this webinar can be viewed again and again on AU's Right to Counsel TA website. And you can catch this webinar and the other 2 webinars. And if you have any other questions from, from you or from other people, and you have these conversations, and you would like the presenters to provide that information, of course, their emails are going to be on the webinar and on that TA website. And you can also email Preeti Menon at the Office of Justice Programs, and we can get those questions and messages to the presenters as well. But again, thanks to both of you, and I wish all of you a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.